Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ASEAN-Japan Center's 53rd ASEAN Anniversary Symposium, entitled Beyond COVID-19, Moving into the New Normal. My name is Aini Aziz. I'll be the MC today, and I'm from the ASEAN-Japan Center. It is a great pleasure to organize this event with the ASEAN Committee in Tokyo. To start off our program, I'd like to invite His Excellency Mr. Min Tu, Ambassador of Myanmar in Japan and Chair of the ASEAN Committee in Tokyo, to deliver his opening remarks.
Your Excellency, Secretary General of ASEAN, the ambassadors from the ASEAN Committee in Tokyo, Secretary General of the ASEAN-Japan Center, special guests from the Gaimusho and MITI, Japan Chamber of Commerce, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Konnichiwa, Minglawa. It is a great honor for me to deliver an opening statement at the symposium in commemorating the 53rd anniversary of ASEAN and addressing the impact of COVID-19 to our region. At the outset, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciations to the ASEAN-Japan Center for organizing this symposium in commemorating the 53rd anniversary of ASEAN. I also wish to express my appreciations to the ASEAN Committee in Tokyo, ASEAN Secretariat, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Japan Chamber of Commerce and Industry for co-organizing this virtual webinar event. I also wish to extend a warm welcome to all participants who have joined today's symposium with great interest. The theme of our symposium, Beyond COVID-19, Moving into the New Normal, is most timely and greatly relevant for all of us. Excellencies, ASEAN will stay focused in our commitment of our integration and ASEAN community building process. We need to develop a robust, holistic, and pragmatic approach in order to mitigate the economic impact of this pandemic. We are grateful that ASEAN dialogue partners, including Japan, have been playing a pivotal role in the development and regional economic integration of ASEAN. We are confident that our close and strategic partner, Japan, will continue to be crucial for the sustainable development of ASEAN in the years ahead. I do believe that today's symposium can play a catalyst role in providing a fruitful dialogue between ASEAN and Japan. Excellencies, the COVID-19 pandemic has been spreading with an alarming speed, shaking the foundations of our health systems, affecting millions of people, disrupting economic activities, and derailing development prospects around the world. During this global pandemic, key economic sectors, particularly industry, travel and tourism, retail sectors, and other services sectors were affected. The supply chain has also been disrupted, and employment and livelihood of the people were at particular risk. It is therefore imperative that ASEAN and Japan should effectively address this emerging challenge and come up with effective measures to counter the impact of this global pandemic. We also need to initiate innovative and resilient measures and strategies. We believe that ASEAN continue to engage with our dialogue partners and international communities to contribute to ensure that our economies open and stable during the global pandemic. It is also paramount important to prepare ourselves to address the post-COVID-19 era and the new normal environment. Excellencies, we should turn these emerging challenges into unique opportunities to raise a sense of urgency for a change and deepen our commitment to prepare ourselves beyond COVID-19. Moreover, we strongly believe that ASEAN-Japan strategic partnership has been elevated to a higher level. We reaffirm the importance of the ASEAN-Japan strategic partnership and renew our commitment to further strengthen our close ties between ASEAN and Japan. Before concluding, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciations to the ASEAN-Japan Center and the co-organizers of this important symposium. I wish the symposium a great success and all the participants a most rewarding and productive deliberations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Excellency. It is now a great honor to invite His Excellency Datu Lim Jock Hoi, ASEAN Secretary General, to deliver his keynote address.
Thank you, Annie. His Excellency Mr. Min Tu, Ambassador of Republic of Union of Myanmar to Japan, the Chair of ASEAN Committee in Tokyo, Excellency Fujita-san, Secretary General of ASEAN-Japan Center. Good afternoon, and friends of ASEAN. I'm delighted to join this 53rd ASEAN Anniversary Symposium, and I would like to thank Fujita-san for the invitation. Thank you also to all of you in Tokyo for celebrating the 53rd anniversary of ASEAN through this symposium. In Jakarta, our celebration this year was made memorable by the fact that we had a first virtual anniversary celebration for the first time. And we also have ASEAN online sale for the first time. No one can deny that we are now living in a very uncertain time. This unprecedented pandemic crisis has turned into an unprecedented uncertain for the region. But this is not the first time that our region has faced these difficult times. With the memories of the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and the global financial meltdown in 2008, still not too far from to forget. In fact, looking back at the history of ASEAN, our regions indeed born out of uncertainty of its time 53 years ago. But we have emerged strong and resilient all these years. But that's why I'm confident that this pandemic crisis will also pass and we will recover. As we gathered here today, the region's economic outlook remains uncertain. By the end of this year, ASEAN is expected to contract by 2.7%, the first economic contraction in the last 22 years. Already, the negative impact of the pandemic is already being felt across the region. By the end of second quarter, economic growth across countries sputtered, with notable contraction in Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and others. Tourism, aviation, and the manufacturing sectors are being hit hardest. The global pandemic has not only caused loss of life, but also livelihoods, as unemployment and business closure continues to rise across the region, affecting especially the vulnerable groups such as the small, micro business enterprises and informal workers. COVID-19 is transforming the world like no others. People talk about new normal, but what exactly is the new normal? I'm glad that this forum is being organized at this critical juncture, as it provides us an opportunity to have a conversation on what is the new normal and how economic partnerships, such as that of between ASEAN and Japan, can guide us through this new normal. ASEAN at the midpoint of implementing ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025 when COVID-19 struck the region and spread so quickly across the globe. ASEAN was making headway on initiatives that aim at facilitating trade and investment in the region. Little that we know that this would eventually be made more meaningful as countries committed to keep market open, promote unimpeded flow of trade in goods, especially essential goods in response to COVID-19 pandemic. With COVID-19 and the so-called new normal, the AEC Blueprint 2025 midterm review also has to ensure that ASEAN economic integration and community building efforts remains relevant, effective, and able to withstand future challenges. But ever since we faced with this pandemic, the determination in the region to fight has remained strong. ASEAN countries have been able to respond with action that are decisive, targeted, and measured. For example, the ASEAN Health Sector Cooperation activated national and regional preparedness and response mechanism for public threat, which has resulted in the immediate detection of cases, delivery of medical care, conduct of contact tracing, and scaling up the public awareness and risk communication. On the political front, the response has been firm and timely. At the 36th ASEAN Summit in June, ASEAN leaders announced the establishment of COVID-19 Response Fund and the ASEAN Regional Reserve of Medical Supply to facilitate cooperation against COVID-19 and the development of comprehensive recovery plan to address social economic impact of the pandemic. The leaders also reiterated the importance of implementing some cross-border measures as soon as possible, such as travel bubbles or travel corridors, as a stepping stone for the region's recovery. On the economic front, our economic ministers reaffirmed more action to enhance economic resilience of the region by keeping market open as instructed by leaders, strengthening supply chain connectivity, and maintaining macroeconomic and financial stability. This commitment was turned into an action with the adoption of the Hanoi Plan of Action on strengthening ASEAN economic cooperation and supply chain connectivity and response to COVID-19 pandemic. Even our partner from other countries, international organizations, and private sector have been collaborating with us to combat this pandemic. For example, an ASEAN-Japan Economic Resilience Action Plan has been developed to mitigate the adverse impact of the pandemic and strengthen economic resilience between ASEAN and Japan. Just a few days ago, I had the privilege of meeting with Mr. Soichi Ogiwara and his colleague from the Federation of Japan Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FJCCIA, who expressed the support to expand their business operation in ASEAN despite the current uncertainty. ASEAN recognizes that while the immediate priority now is to overcome this pandemic, there is a need to look ahead in terms of cautiously starting to reopen or to plan to reopen the economy and preparing for recovery. The region is now in the process of developing a comprehensive recovery framework as part of our effort to move forward from the crisis. The framework should take the region at the various stages of recovery, starting from reopening of the economy, recovery phase, and eventually towards a longer-term resilience and competitiveness. But when the region is emerged from the current crisis, it's difficult to predict as the pandemic still continues to play out, and which makes the strength of recovery also unpredictable. But there are lessons that we can already glean. We know how the pandemic has changed the way we live, work, and interact. For example, we have seen government in ASEAN becoming more emboldened with quick decision making to deal with the crisis. Business responding quickly to rethink their supply chain, and individuals getting more concerned to change their social behavior and follow a new social norm. Indeed, we have seen a dramatic restructuring of economic and social order that we have never seen before. Perhaps this is already what we call as the new normal. But whether it is the new normal or the next normal, the post-pandemic world will be different era because we know how our current social and economic reality in ASEAN have been rendered irrelevant by this pandemic. For example, in the case of ASEAN economic integration, the new normal will present fundamental changes in the way economic activities are structured. But a key question is how to navigate the viable path to the next normal. I can see many possibilities. First, there will be a greater realization of the importance of cross-cutting issues, particularly the intersection between ASEAN economic integration and other pillars of ASEAN. The effect of non-economic instability or crisis on the economy and the impact of economic activity to other areas such as environment or education will be brought to the forefront. So we can expect to see a greater focus on resilience and sustainability, which have to date to been overshadowed by efficiency considerations. Second, emerging trends such as digitalization will be accelerated. While this has been high on the ASEAN agenda in recent years, there will be a renewed sense of urgency, particularly in areas with direct impact to the people, such as e-commerce, e-payment, e-learning, e-governance, broadband connectivity, but also on the fundamentals of digital transformation from infrastructure to regulation and institution, from digital skill and literacy to cybersecurity. Similarly, there will be greater appreciation of the notion of inclusivity with due consideration given to the MSME, the informal sector, and of course, women. Third, ASEAN will also be focusing on optimizing the potential of intra-ASEAN trade and investment, not because it's turning inward, but given the realization that the external market is unlikely to be our sole survivors for this crisis. In fact, this provides a momentum for ASEAN to tackle heads-on its long-standing key commitment for market integration. At the same time, effort for trade facilitation as well as investment promotion and facilitation will also need to be redoubled. Fourth, global supply chain restructuring is likely, but the effect will not be automatic. ASEAN must therefore focus on improving its appeal and competitiveness as an investment destination and a trade and production hub. This would include addressing the fundamentals such as building a critical infrastructure, improving connectivity and labor productivity, good regulatory practices, among others. Finally, ASEAN will remain open for business. Market will keep open for trade and investment, and we will further work on strengthening the utilization of our FTAs. We expect the RCEP will be signed by the end of this year, hope for its early entry into force, which will be a boom to business and investors' confidence in the much needed time for recovery. In closing, ASEAN is indeed in a crisis like no other. It is a crisis where restructuring of global and economic order seems imminent. How ASEAN should prepare itself for a changed world is indeed a challenge and imperative of our time. But the path to recovery will reveal not just the vulnerabilities, but also the opportunity for a new beginning. The new normal is certainly a different normal. How to make it better? Normal depends on how we take our lesson seriously from this pandemic crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Datu. And now for the panel discussion on moving into the new normal, where we have 3 panelists. The first panelist is Dr. Fukunari Kimura, professor at the Faculty of Economics at Keio University in Japan. He is also the chief economist from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, or AREA. Our second panelist is Dr. Seiya Sukegawa, professor at the Faculty of Political Science and Economics in Kokushikan University, Japan. And finally, our third panelist is joining us from the Philippines, Dr. Maria Socorro G. Bautista, professor at the School of Economics at the University of the Philippines. May I first invite Professor Kimura to open the discussion with his presentation, Moving into the New Normal. Professor Kimura, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we will have 3 panelists, and the first I will make some short presentation on the talk titled Moving into the New Normal in ASEAN. And then after that, 2 other panelists will give us also the short talks, partially comment and criticism on my talk, and partially giving more information and expand the scope of the talk. Then after that, as far as time allows, we will go into a discussion. First, I'd like to go to my presentation. Okay. Actually, I can't really see that on the screen. It's okay. Right. Okay. So the title is Moving into the New Normal in ASEAN. I'd like to go to second page. Okay. I think first, healthcare policy is extremely important. If we look at ASEAN member states, some are doing pretty well in containing the pandemics to some extent. Say Vietnam is one of the examples, and also Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. We did not have much data, but it's relatively okay. Thailand seems to be okay now. Singapore, Malaysia struggled in April, May, but seems to be getting calmed down. But the Philippines, Indonesia are still struggling. So I think it's very important to contain pandemics within the capacity of healthcare services. So we have limited healthcare services, particularly in case of developing countries. That kind of capacity is pretty small, so we have to be very careful. And also, after that, certainly we have to remove various restrictions on the movement of people, but we have to do that very carefully. So we would start from domestic movements and then gradually going to cross-border. But this very important thing is that we really have to prioritize healthcare first. Because the sequencing of policies from emergency responses to exit policy is very, very important. Even in case of Japan, it's really struggling actually. So we are thinking that maybe the second wave is now coming, and how to move to exit policy from emergency responses. That's a very important thing. And so once we got a failure, then actually the cost could be very, very large, politically and also economically. So this is one thing, of course, that we have to take care of that. Go to page 3, please. One very important thing, particularly when we think of the exit policy, is that what sort of shock we are facing with now. So actually, we have a sort of discussion that started with both supply shock and demand shock. If you look at this short article by Richard Baldwin, he claimed that. And that's quite true, even in the case of ASEAN and East Asia. Actually, the supply shock came first in probably January, February, and March. Some supplies were interrupted, particularly coming from China. So that could be a sort of intermediate goods, parts and components of machines and others. But at the same time, as I highlighted one is, say, medical supplies and masks and those kind of things. So I think we have a sort of really a big shock from a sort of supply shock. So in case of masks and others, actually, it's not a supply shock, but that's actually the positive demand shock on our side. And so a sort of shortage of supply came, actually. So we had some really big debates after that, talking about the robustness or resiliency of supply chains. So one thing that we have to be very careful is that the emergency or essential goods versus other goods, those are quite different, actually. So emergency goods, essential goods, certainly we need some sort of a really robustness. We have to have a sort of supply even if the situation is really, really bad. But in case for other goods, sometimes the supply chains are interrupted. We really need to have a sort of robustness to keep production continuously or not. Or even if we are interrupted, we really want to have a sort of backing up the supply. That is a resiliency. Is it enough? So I think that's the one very important issue that we have to talk about. But now what's going on is that still some countries are struggling with really calming down the pandemics. So actually the supply and demand both are really slowed down because of social distancing. So we cannot avoid that. But beyond that, what would happen in exit stage? I believe that could be a sort of huge demand shock, huge negative demand shock. That is domestic for each country and also at the level of a region and also at the level of the world. So this negative demand shock could be huge, possibly larger than global financial crisis, or maybe it's really pretty much equivalent to Great Depression. So suddenly, compared with a global financial crisis in 2008-2009, at that time we had a really difficulty in the financial sector. So that was just like a sort of a heart disease. So it's really serious. So the blood circulation has some problem at that time. So that was a sort of big disease. But this time, this is actually COVID, but it's like a sort of injury this time. Actually, the financial sector is still okay. So I think the type of shock could be different, possibly, but so that could give us some sort of possibly optimistic view on this time, but maybe not. If we look at the growth forecast, I showed some examples made by IMF World Economic Outlook growth projection in June. At the world level, this year, minus 4.9. China, actually, it's an early recovery, then 1%. ASEAN, minus 2. Actually, Vietnam is a slightly positive, but others are negative. India, minus 4.5. Actually, those are worst after World War II. 2021, actually, the forecast is looking at a sort of early recovery. So the growth rates are coming back to positive, but actually this level of positive growth rates are not really backing up to the original growth path. So that was the forecast in June. Then actually the forecast is getting worse and worse over time. So we really watch carefully on that. So I think a very important thing is that now overall prices are going down. basically. So that means that the demand shock will come. So I think that's what we really have to overcome. Next page, please, page 4. So one big issue is the production networks. Actually, production networks, or sometimes we will call the so-called the second unbundling, task-wise, production process-wise division of labor. Actually, the ASEAN and East Asia are having a very strong aspect of utilizing this type of international division of labor. Not all countries can do that in the world. Actually, this type of international division of labor is applied in East Asia and also some Eastern European countries. Then in Latin America, probably only Mexico and Costa Rica. So I think a very limited number of developing countries are doing this kind of international division of labor. So I think this is a big strength in ASEAN. But we had a sort of a supply shock first. So people are worrying about a sort of robustness and also resilience of this kind of production networks. So, but one thing that we have to look at is that our production system is almost intact, almost there so far. So actually we have the accumulation of empirical studies in the past. In the case of global financial crisis or East Japan earthquake, then actually if the shock is temporary, or people think that the shock is temporary, then actually the production networks are pretty robust and resilient. So it's not likely to be interrupted, or even if interrupted, it's more likely to come back early. So I think one more optimistic view is that if the shock is short and not quite deep, then production networks can revive relatively early. But actually the long recession forces production networks to reshuffle very seriously, because that kind of robustness and resiliency coming from the initial investment. So they commit to that kind of a connection. But if the recession is prolonged, actually once they give up maintaining those kind of networks, then that could be gone for forever. Actually, so that is a sort of really important aspect that we have to talk about in production networks. Another argument is that now ICT introduction is accelerated, information communication technologies. So some people say that the global value chains are gone. So that kind of era is already gone. Then many manufacturing activities may come back to developed countries. That is so-called reshoring. But if you look at ASEAN and East Asia, so far we have not observed massive reshoring in Asia, yet at least. So it's just a temporary or not, we have to watch very carefully, of course. But probably the international division of labor with politically, economically stable developing countries like ASEAN will continue to be important. So that could be a sort of really optimistic view. It's an arguable point, of course. But another is that ICT is coming in. So we will have ample room for so-called cross-border service outsourcing. That is so-called third unbundling. That would come. The Philippines is doing so-called BP or business processing operations. Actually, that kind of service outsourcing could be a new type of international division of labor in the future. That could be bigger and bigger. So that kind of trend is accelerated. So those are another thing. Then the China factor. Then actually the confrontation between the US and China is getting even worse actually after COVID-19. So how far it would go, it's a sort of not just a sort of trade war, but it's coming into a sort of really technological rivalry. So how far we would have so-called decoupling is coming. This is another element that many firms have to think of that very seriously. So of course, Asian countries, including Japan and also including ASEAN, would like to keep good economic relationship with both the US and China. Both are very important economic partners. But if decoupling is really coming and we would have some sort of connection with national security issues and others, then we have to do some decision making. So how far we would have decoupling, this is another very important element that we have to think of. Next, please. Page 5. So when we think of the policy framework for emerging Asia Pacific or ASEAN, actually the following is a sort of tentative framework for the exit strategies by ASEAN member states. Actually, the classifying policies into emergency responses, exit policies and policies for the new normal. I think that could be very important. Next page, please. Page 6. That's a big table. So basically, we have 3 phases of policies. And then in the emergency responses, still some ASEAN member states are struggling at this stage. So actually, economic situation at the bottom, we really have to stop economic activities, some economic activities for social distancing in order to contain the pandemics. So the health policy conducts social distancing, and we have to provide testing and keep medical treatments within the capacity. I think that could be a very, very important thing. At the macroeconomic policy, stabilize exchange rates and avoid collapse of asset markets. Actually, some local currencies in ASEAN were coming down in March and April, but actually they're coming back so far. So I think the financial sector is so far it's okay, but we are having a really strong macro stimulus and strong macro expenditure now. So I think macro fundamentals could be unstable anytime. So we really have to be careful. And also provide mitigation to help businesses and people at risk. Of course, financial situation is has a sort of limitation, so cannot really cover everything. But so I think this is a very important thing in emergency responses. And then coming into exit policies, once pandemics is within the medical capacity, that we will move to the stage of exit policies. So economic situation is that we would have, unfortunately, prolonged recession in the world, possibly. And also the recovery of cross-border movements of people could be very slow. We have to be very careful in doing that. So with those kind of difficult situation in health policy, carefully remove social distancing and set medical services back to normal. And also in international cooperation, we have to develop international collaboration to exit, say medical supply, vaccines, quarantine. Actually, ASEAN starts working on that, but those kind of international cooperation is very important. Macroeconomic policy, I think we really have to provide macroeconomic stimulus, both monetary and fiscal. But of course, how far we could do that, it depends on the country. But we have to fight against a negative demand shock in the country and also in the region and also in the world. So we have to possibly need to develop international macro policy coordination, possibly. It's not in the political agenda yet, but that could be coming. Then policies for the new normal, that could go in parallel with exit policies, partially. But in health policy, establish long-term healthcare system, disseminate health insurance. Those are actually very expensive. So how far we could do that in the situation of developing countries, we have to think about that very seriously. But people are now really worrying about the health care system. So we really have to take care of that politically and economically. And also develop international cooperation for future pandemic prevention. That's another move that we would have. In macroeconomic policy, we have to resume fiscal health. This is a very, very important but difficult homework, and also address inclusiveness and sustainability, so that we have to come back to that kind of path, and possibly to develop macro policy coordination framework. So that would come. Then economic situation, we would have the new normal and more efficient and thick value-added in production networks. We'd like to have that, and also more penetration of digital technology. So policies for international production networks in emergency responses, probably we have to keep them somehow. Actually, some related industries would have at risk. Actually, logistics, transportation, they are having a very, very serious problem now. And also SMEs, local firms, those would have it's a very big negative effects because of social distancing. So how far we could help them. And then going to exit policies, keep production networks and the related industries alive, and even if we have a worldwide recession, and going a little bit a step forward to strengthen our location advantages and also reduce the servicing costs. So actually, ASEAN would have a sort of opportunities to strengthen the international competitiveness in that sense, because production networks would be reshuffled, and also we would have some China factor too. So ASEAN should be aggressive in attracting economic activities. And then in policies for the new normal, we would have better positioning in IPNs. And also the policies for digital economy, this is another very important aspect. Emergency responses, first, we have to remove bottlenecks for teleworking and other connectivity. But in exit policies, we have to think of how to utilize IT and CT for economic growth. This is another very important thing. So details are in the table. So let's go to the next page, page 7. So the role of ASEAN and ASEAN Plus, East Asia. I think ASEAN can be a model case for the recovery potentially and play a more proactive role in global governance. The reasons, say one is that ASEAN overall contains infection relatively good compared with other parts of the world. And also we believe in freer trade, investment and globalization. And also ASEAN has low uncertainty relatively with a trustable policy environment. And ASEAN can be a winner in reshuffling international production networks and adopting ICT. So I think ASEAN the initiative already starts. Dato' Lim Jook Hoi talked about that already, but established the ASEAN Coordinating Council working group on public health emergencies. That's a sort of collaboration in emergency stage in terms of healthcare. And also the Hanoi Plan of Action on strengthening economic cooperation and ensuring supply chain connectivity. This is also a very important initiative. More will come, but ASEAN should strengthen the cooperation right now. So I think the crucial test will come with a huge worldwide demand shock. That's what we really have to prepare for that. Last page, please. So the references are those. If you'd like to see that more in detail, then please look at those. So thank you very much. That's my talk. Okay, then let's go to two colleagues of mine. The first is Sukegawa-san. Sukegawa-san is a real expert of following up particularly corporate firms' activities in ASEAN, also East Asia. So Sukegawa-san, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, and allow me to speak in Japanese. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on this occasion to celebrate the 53rd anniversary of ASEAN. Dr. Kimura has talked about the actual COVID-19 situation, especially on production network, supply chain. So I'd like to look a little bit more on the current situation as well as provide some comments. First of all, the current situation and how COVID-19 is affecting the supply chain and which direction are we going for. And I have some questions for Dr. Kimura. First of all, looking at the international economic environment surrounding ASEAN, I believe everybody knows, but globalization, I believe East Asia and ASEAN is really being affected by globalization. I am showing you my PowerPoint slides, but if you look at the GDP per capita from the 1970s to 2019, compared to other countries and regions in the world, we have seen it grow, and the personal income, looking at it from export perspective, but I believe people in ASEAN can really feel economic growth. The world has only grown by 2.2 times, but ASEAN has grown by 6 times. In some countries, it has grown even more. So this is because of globalization and also liberalization and also the supply chain. Now, multinational corporations in ASEAN, they are utilizing AFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area, and they have established the intra-regional division of labor, building up the mutual supply chain system up until 2010, and then after that, ASEAN plus 1 FTA, ASEAN plus Japan, ASEAN plus China, FTA, these have developed, and now we see procurement is globalizing. If you look at my next slide, this looks at Japanese companies and their procurement situation, especially Japanese companies in ASEAN region. In the top, you see procurement locally, and in the bottom, you see import procurement, and the ratio coming from China as well as from ASEAN. If you look at this, you can understand that local procurement in ASEAN from 2010 up until 2010 it was going up, but then after that it has slightly gone down. While on the other hand, from China, Japanese companies were looking at ASEAN, China. The operation companies were different, and also procurement were handled differently. However, since the development of FTAs, we see that procurement from China is growing. And as a result of that, in 2019, procurement from ASEAN has been overshadowed by procurement from China. So the supply chain is not just built in ASEAN, but it has also involved China. So we have a much longer, bigger supply chain. And so when disaster strikes, for example, the 2011 flood in Thailand, we see that the supply chain's breaking up. So it means that we now have this risk of the supply chain breakage. And now with COVID-19, we are seeing once again the supply chain facing a crisis. Secondly, when we look at the current situation, the disparity between developed countries and developing countries, yes, it's clear, but because of globalization, as you see what's happening in the United States, we see domestic economic disparity, which leads to frustration among people, and that's why we see the Trump administration being born and the TPP situation with the United States. And now we see something counter to globalization, protectionism, coming into the picture. We have seen such development in the past 3-4 years. But we have been blessed with globalization, and the border walls have been coming down, but now we are seeing the infection spreading. We see cross-border crime also spreading, which is the negative effect of globalization. So in order to prevent such things, we need to have a re-establishment of global collaboration and a rethinking of what we want to see in the next version of globalization. The hegemons like United States, China, and the conflict we see between these two giants, we are affected by that. ASEAN versus China. Of course, ASEAN cannot say that we partner with the United States only or we partner with China only. This year, we will have the U.S. presidential election. This is going to probably affect the whole world. Let's say the next administration is democratic. Probably we will not see any retaliation in the area of tariffs, so we might see the situation change from where we are today. But how did the coronavirus affect the economic environment? Dr. Kimura mentioned, but Vietnam, Thai, they have managed the situation quite well. And temporarily, we have seen infection grow in Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, but now it seems that the disease is contained rather well. Spreading still is in Philippines and Indonesia, but in these two countries, people who have been working abroad, they have rushed back home, and this situation is still continuing. Therefore, it is inevitable that infection is spreading. And I believe this is also a backlash of the globalization that we've seen in the past. Now, what is the effect of the coronavirus on ASEAN? Initially, the disease started in China, and therefore we have seen some delays in procurement from China. Procurement from China took time, and this caused a lot of confusion. And masks and other medical masks, gowns, we have seen shortage, and people were rushing to get their hands on these products. Once a vaccine and treatment is developed, we might see another shortage of these. We have seen city lockdowns, border closures to contain corona, and that has led to stagnation of economic activities. And people's interaction cross-border. In some countries, very cautiously, we are now seeing borders being open to business travelers, but countries that were tourist destinations, they are still facing a very difficult time. Now, what about the supply chain? When we look at the supply chain, air freight has gone down drastically. For example, in Thailand, the flights are now maybe 20%, 10% of where they were. Land transportation, basically, for example, in Thailand, Thailand has only opened one part of their border for land transportation, but this is going on. Although the volume has gone down, but we do see land transportation still being operated, and marine transportation also. It is operating at a rate of 70-80% of normal times, but it is still ongoing. But movement of people is difficult, and how will that affect businesses? Rather than export and import, I believe it is going to affect investments. And as you see in the slide, this is from 2 days ago, Nippon Keizai Shinbun. I have taken it from the front page. Some shocking figures here. This is 2020 April to June period, the second quarter of this year. the GDP minus 9.1% year on year, almost a two-digit decline, which is 3.5 times larger than what we've seen during the global financial crisis. And China, increase of 3.2% in the second quarter because they have contained the infection. And for ASEAN, we will not be able to depend on international exports. Therefore, the reliance on China for ASEAN countries may become greater. That is one concern. And when we think about the global economy, we are seeing a decline in demand. If this is prolonged, local companies, local Japanese companies, and companies within the supply chain may see that the supply chain itself will be damaged. They may find themselves in financial difficulty. But how will you keep the supply chain open and alive is a big issue. We need to have some support systems for the whole supply chain to keep jobs, to keep the finance flowing. If there are weak businesses, maybe do some M&A so that the cash shortage does not occur. Well, then, what should happen to the supply chain towards the future? Right now, there is a review of the supply chain going on. In the past, people were seeking efficiency, lower costs, more efficiency in the supply chain. But from now on, people will seek more resilience in the supply chain. So from just-in-time to a just-in-case kind of management, and procurement from several countries, several locations, not just from one country, because sometimes that becomes meaningless. So you have to have several countries where you buy things from and also have a larger stock of things. Decentralize production and commission out to multiple locations. There are many things that we will have to look at. But in any case, the ASEAN supply chain reestablishment will lead to resilience of ASEAN itself. Well then, what kind of investments are being thought about? I would like to look through some things. On Monday, Nikkei Business, the latest issue came out, and it looked at the coronavirus affecting the supply chain. So if you look at this, and this is a survey of major Japanese companies, but many companies are saying they are reviewing their supply chain. So some companies, already 30% of the companies are saying that they have discussed and they have decided on measures to be taken. So nearly 80% are saying that with the coronavirus situation, they are reviewing their supply chain. Now, among the 80%, if you look at the next page, what kind of review is being made on their supply chains? So buying parts and material from multiple companies, 60%. Multiple production hubs, nearly half of the companies say that they are looking at that, and they want to look upstream of the supply chain and gather information, nearly 50%. And also stocking up on inventory, more than 30%. And about 1/4 of the many companies are saying that they want to operate factories with fewer workers. And this is not just about Japanese companies. Probably in Southeast Asia, where Japanese companies are active, we may see a restructuring happen following these ideas. Well, then, what is it that ASEAN needs to do after this? One thing is, as we have heard from Dr. Lim Jokhoi, RCEP, we need to have this signed. That's one thing that will be necessary. ASEAN countries will have to sign the RCEP. And looking at the media in Thailand, it seems that some regional scrutiny of RCEP has already been finished, and each country are preparing to sign this at the RCEP summit in November. India probably will not be among the countries to sign the RCEP, which is a big hit to us. However, we need to continue on this path. And I believe signing the RCEP will have a big meaning. How do we really utilize the RCEP agreement is one thing. Basically, ASEAN plus one FTA countries are involved in the RCEP. Already FTAs are there. But with RCEP, tariffs will come down further along the way. So, other than tariff, how do we utilize RCEP? That is something that countries will need to think about right away. And secondly, countries that were not connected so far, Japan, China, South Korea, these three countries need to be connected. FTA connecting these three countries will be key in really utilizing this new framework to be built. And ASEAN has been blessed by globalization, and now after RCEP, I hope that ASEAN countries will continue on this path. And because we are in this crisis situation, digitalization should be promoted. For example, from September 1st, some new digital technology usage will start to speed up the supply chain operations. And next, the new coronavirus, of course, we don't have a vaccine yet. It seems that Russia is saying that they have developed a vaccine. However, it may take time until it spreads around the world. Toward the second wave and toward the next emergency risk, we need to establish a more resilient, stronger supply chain. And as we heard from the ASEAN Secretary General, critical substances to be stocked in ASEAN so that it can be mutually utilized among member states. A mechanism should be in place so that it really happens. For example, utilizing a Chiang Mai initiative. Chiang Mai initiative was, of course, for currency swap, but maybe we can have a similar arrangement for material goods. And as some questions for Dr. Kimura, I have two questions actually. One is balancing infection and economy is going to be key. So the government as well as the industry needs to be firm in their stance to keep the supply chain open. And we need to get our heads together for that. So then how can ASEAN collaborate? and take measures to keep the supply chains open? That's one question. And the second one is, well, I have talked about some example of Japanese companies, but we will have to go through a review of the production network. The supply chain will have to be shorter, will have to be closer to make sure that it doesn't go across many, many borders. But how do we make the supply chain more resilient against external shocks? What kind of policy should ASEAN countries take for that? And RCEP and AEC 2025, what are the roles that these arrangements can have, or should they be reviewed? That's my question towards Dr. Kimura. And with that, I would like to end my comments and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sugawa-san. I think that was a very comprehensive review of what's going on in supply chains right now. I'd like to have some points to discuss, probably not 100% agreeable actually. So we have to make some sort of discussion later. But for the sake of the time, let's go to the other panelist, Dr. Maria Bautista. Actually, we call her Corina. She has a much stronger background in macroeconomics, so probably particularly in the macroeconomic viewpoint, I hope that Corina would correct me to some extent. So Corina, could you talk about that?
Thank you, Kimura-san. Thank you for inviting me to participate at this symposium to celebrate the 53rd anniversary of ASEAN. Well, I just want to give some comments, some feedback on your presentation. And to start, I want to first say that I agree with you when you say that, and I quote, "Human life is of utmost importance and that it must be prioritized over other issues," unquote, including economic recovery. And I think that the epidemiological course of the pandemic will determine the course of the economy. One cannot make a case for dealing with the recession induced by the deliberate stilling of the economy via lockdowns in order to contain the spread of COVID-19 or the hit on balance sheets, unless, as you say, the pandemic curve is kept within the capacity of healthcare systems. So I think this is the correct sequencing. It is important to correctly identify the nature of the shocks, whether they're demand or supply shocks, because macroeconomic policies needed to address them differ. Policies such as lowering interest rates and increasing government spending to stimulate demand, for example, worsen problems of inadequate supply. On the other hand, policies to deal with insufficient supply, such as relaxing lockdowns and reopening the economy or giving tax and debt relief, do not work to restore output growth when aggregate demand is muted or constrained. Therefore, it's important to be able to differentiate demand from supply shocks arising from COVID-19. Now, in economics, we have a simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And we know that when the aggregate price level rises and output falls, that we are dealing with a supply shock, or at least in a situation where supply shocks dominate. On the other hand, if the aggregate price level and aggregate output both decline, then we know we're dealing with a situation in which the demand shock is dominant, even while there might be an adverse supply shock. Now, the problem with the shocks such as COVID-19 is that these shocks have varying sectoral effects. So if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, you look at the demand for certain things like health products, the demand for these health products increased, while the demand for non-essential goods and services like restaurant meals or hotel rooms, the demand for these goods and services largely vanished. Now, the problem is the tools of monetary policy, of macro policy, where we use fiscal and monetary policy, are not designed to deal with problems at a sectoral level. They are designed to deal with problems at an aggregate level. So therefore, it is very difficult to custom fit monetary policy or government spending and tax policy at a sectoral level. The country effects of this pandemic shock are also uneven across ASEAN. So Vietnam is still expected to post positive growth this year, while countries and other ASEAN countries that have had less success in controlling the spread of the virus are faring worse. So the Philippines, for example, saw its GDP growth year on year in second quarter of this year slump to 16.5%, which is the lowest in 4 decades. Countries like Singapore, which had initial success at containment of the virus, have also seen a steep decline in the second quarter after a second wave occurred. So these adverse economic outcomes seem to hold regardless of how connected countries are to international production networks or IPNs. The Philippines, for example, is not as connected to IPNs as other countries in the region are. Yet, the Philippines was more badly hit than countries such as Thailand or Malaysia, which are more connected to IPNs. So it is unclear to what extent the propagation of shocks via IPNs occurs. And evidently, there is no one-size-fits-all approach based on IPN connections. What does seem to be the case in general, however, is that a policy of dealing with the health crisis first and ensuring that the health system is in a country is capable of managing COVID-19 and succeeding waves is common to countries with better or good economic outcomes. We do not know how IPNs will be reconfigured post-COVID-19, nor do we know by how much trade volumes will fall this year. The WTO, for example, estimates that trade volumes will decline by this year, but the estimates lie within a very large band. It's something between minus 13% and minus 34%. And this is indicative of the great uncertainty that exists today. So in contrast, Kimura-san, you seem sure that, quote, once the shock is over, production and trade can return faster and stronger along networks than in other types of activities. So I think you may be a little too optimistic because what the network configurations will be post-COVID-19 is largely unknown. And if key links are permanently lost, then maybe production and trade in some sectors may not return. The other issue is this supposed massive reshoring in Asia, which has not been observed. And this is likely due to low global demand overall currently and expectations that this state of low demand will persist. So there's a lack of animal spirits, which keep output supply low because there's little reason for investors to invest and consumers to consume. The best way to reduce uncertainty and raise confidence, seems to me, is to deal with the health crisis first and get it under control. And in terms of macro policy, finding ways to keep the economy afloat in the meantime is key. So in Europe, for example, the ECB is employing unconventional policy, including buying corporate bonds in addition to sovereign bonds to support corporations. The lack of evidence of massive reshoring to Asia may also be an indication that the existing patterns of comparative advantage have not yet been disrupted or changed in any significant way by the course of the pandemic, or simply because not enough time has elapsed for all the effects to work their way through the economy. Perhaps new areas of comparative advantage have not been revealed by markets yet because of disruptions to the price signaling system and the inability to know whether shocks have temporary or permanent effects. So I'm also unsure why Kimura-san would like to think of how to keep IPNs as they were pre-COVID, as opposed to allowing market participants to find new areas of comparative advantage. So the question is, should the emergence of new IPNs be encouraged rather than aiming to merely maintain existing ones at any cost. I agree with you that the trough of global economic performance is likely to be very deep and prolonged. As you say, causing a serious demand shock which may decay the whole economy. But in fact, the huge demand shock is already here. It is not impending. In response to a serious demand shock, you say, and I quote, at that point, macro stimulus will be crucial and we must pay attention to how our production networks could survive, unquote. Now, will macro stimulus work in cases where the pre-COVID-19 business models are no longer going to be viable post-COVID-19? If companies were to go bankrupt temporarily because a lockdown prevented consumers from being able to consume the goods and services they produce, or because supply disruptions constrained production, then government can help these businesses stay afloat to at least meet payroll costs and certain costs during the crisis. And we can expect that when the economy reopens, demand will return. On the other hand, if certain businesses are no longer going to be viable in the post-COVID-19 world, then governments should not infuse money to indefinitely prop them up, lest they end up with being zombie firms. Some supply chains will be permanently disrupted, as we have seen even from the US-China trade war, and some firms in these chains may be gone permanently. More importantly, it seems to me, government must provide public goods and structure incentives in a way that encourages businesses to look for new areas of comparative advantage in the post-COVID-19 world. For example, government could invest in better internet facilities, a wider broadband that will help not only businesses, but also help deliver education, for example, to a wider audience. In this, I agree with your emphasis on the importance of the acceleration of ICT introduction. The services sector makes tradable goods more competitive. You mentioned BPOs. BPOs are business processes outsourcing. If protectionist policies in the US induce for US firms to reshore previously outsourced services, the goods that those US firms produce using outsourced services will now be more expensive when produced in the US. And the comparative advantage in producing these goods can shift to other countries that take the US's place in the use of outsourced BPO services. So this is an example how IPNs might change due to a shock such as COVID-19. On the China decoupling issue, I'm likewise unsure to what extent countries will want to consciously decouple, or if they can even unconsciously decouple from China. So in a study of the effects of the US-China trade war in the Philippines, for example, which you were the discussant of our paper, we were surprised to find that the country, the Philippines, was already extremely dependent on China, both as a source of imports and as a destination of exports pre-trade war, even prior to the trade war. Although the trade war massively reduces trade volume, according to our model, we find that the patterns of trade for the Philippines, at least, remain the same. So the Philippines has not seen any reshoring of industries to it from China, with the exception of online gambling, because online gambling is illegal in China. On emergency responses under macro policy, Kimura-san, you recommend the following: stabilize exchange rates and prevent a collapse of asset markets. However, during the period when countries are still grappling to control the pandemic, and perhaps even for some time after, unconventional monetary policy may be needed, possibly monetizing government debt for government to be able to finance increased COVID-19 related expenditures at a time when tax revenues have collapsed. These actions will naturally exert depreciation pressures on the domestic currency, but this is not the time to stabilize the exchange rate, meaning do not try to prevent large currency depreciation, nor worry about supporting asset markets at the expense of spending to contain the pandemic. You have a suggestion to keep IPNs and related industries alive with social distancing. Now, while governments certainly want to keep their economies going, much depends on the ability, again, to contain the disease. I also think that it may be too much to ask governments to keep all IPNs and related industries alive. Some of these IPNs will naturally be disrupted permanently and or may not be viable in the post-COVID-19 world because comparative advantage may shift some other product or service or method of production. Hence, some of these IPNs should not be kept afloat by government. It seems to me that during this pandemic, the focus of many governments has been to ensure that the food supply chain and other essential sectors in the domestic economy remain functioning. Ensuring the survival of IPNs is not the main priority of governments now because external demand has collapsed and is likely to be down for a long time, and also because it is unclear how IPNs will be reconfigured. With even more limited resources, governments have had to prioritize spending and focus on social protection and the delivery of essential goods and services. There is no mention of international policy coordination under the emergency response phase of macro policy. This international policy coordination appears only under exit policies and the policies under the new normal. So now the question is, what is the scope for and importance of a regional response during this crisis itself? I think Professor Saya also had the same question. It seems that if there is any incentive to try and resolve a seemingly insurmountable challenge that is common to countries in the region, it would be at the height of the crisis, not when the crisis is over. Even trying to stabilize exchange rates in the emergency response phase, or any phase if that is the aim, entails cooperation and rules to prevent beggar thy neighbor kinds of policies. On the role of ASEAN, I think it is difficult to generalize about ASEAN being, quote, a model for recovery, unquote, given the heterogeneity in country experiences and outcome. Perhaps ASEAN and other countries can learn from the good experiences of countries like Vietnam in containing the pandemic and being able to sustain economic growth. I agree with Kimura-san on ASEAN and Asian countries in general being firm believers and advocates of free trade because they've been the beneficiaries of the gains from trade. But I do not think that this necessarily means preserving pre-COVID IPNs, pre-COVID-19 IPNs. Ways to increase aggregate demand and attract investment to the region need to be formulated, as supply chains will not automatically come to the region any more than they did in the aftermath of the US-China trade war, which is still ongoing. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corina. I think two comments are very, very good. I think those comments are really deepening the discussion that we really have to think of. I think one issue related to supply chains is that how far the government can do, and also how far supply chains are important, why supply chain will be reshuffled this time. I think that's a sort of big homework. To me, it's a sort of really brief answer to Sukegawa-san and partially to Corina, is that I think the supply chains or production networks are very, very important to keep ASEAN strong in international competitiveness. But what governments should do is that the first thing that they really have to think of is to strengthen their international competitiveness. In doing that, I think that's they have to improve location advantages and also the reduction in service link costs. I think those are essentially important. And maybe some micro things like strengthening training when labor is relatively less stressful in production. Actually, we did that a lot in global financial crisis. I think those kind of things could be done. And also, we do not exclude exploring a new competitive advantage, of course. And that's, say, BPOs is one of them, of course. And we really have to do that very seriously. So one quick question to Corina. We have a sort of a growth forecast by major international organizations like World Bank, IMF, ADB, and they said that we may have a sort of really V-shaped recovery in 2021. And that may seem to be too optimistic. What would be your view on a sort of growth forecast, particularly in the next year? Corina?
But I think that it's anybody's guess. I think there's just too much uncertainty to make a guess about the growth, what the growth forecast will be. But I think more important than trying to guess what the GDP growth will be is to understand whether what we are talking about is a deviation from the trend in growth path or a structural break in the trend path of growth. When we talk about a rebound and V-shaped recovery, actually V-shaped rebound, we're really talking about just stopping the decline in GDP growth and proceeding on the same path and reversing the decline to make it a positive growth. But is that really what we are talking about now? I think initially, in the earlier part of the pandemic, people didn't think this would last more than 3 months, right? But now that it has, and in some countries it looks to be uncontrolled, and with disruptions to supply chains and the prolonged decline in global demand. As you point out, it is unclear to me how how the growth path will be. Are we talking about recovery to where we were pre-COVID, to the levels we were pre-COVID? I have a feeling that the new normal is going to be a slightly lower, permanently lower growth path, new growth path.
Yeah, thank you very much. To Sukegawa-san, I think Nikkei businesses figures are very interesting. I think the supply of parts and components from China does not have much problem now, but people are still talking about resiliency. So one factor is, of course, China factor, political factor, but companies say that the increases in inventory stock, right? That's quite different from a sort of view on demand shock, actually. So I'm wondering what they are worrying about. That's how to interpret those kind of figures. I'm a bit confused on that, actually. So can I have some idea how to understand these results?
I understand. For example, about the increase in the inventory of the parts and materials in the middle part of the supply chain, I think it's about the business in the middle part of the supply chain. In order to keep the supply chain moving and surviving, they believe that this should never be stopped. It doesn't mean that other things can be stopped, but anyway, the parts and materials will have to be secured more than necessary. And I think that's the reality of.
So the restrictions on people's movement would have some sort of effect on those kind of things. Probably they feel that the supply chains are really not moving smoothly right now. So that's why they like to have some sort of protection over that. So is that what you think of that?
The movement of people is not having much impact on the trade, import-export, I believe. But on the investment,
Of course, new investments, because you cannot physically go there, it's going to be very difficult. And about the expanded investment, the investment to enhance the supply chain or energy saving, rather than increasing the number of items, it's going to be an investment in order to make yourself more lean. I think that's the kind of the investment we are seeing increase.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, so we have to finish the panel. But I think we had a bunch of fruitful thought. One is macroeconomic issues. We have to watch very carefully what sort of shocks we are having and what we can do, and also for supply chain issues. Actually, the movement of companies is still pretty confusing, actually. So we really have to think of that, what we should do very seriously. So thank you very much. I'd like to close the panel now.
Thank you very much to our three panelists for the insightful discussions. Moving on, I'd now like to invite Mr. Masataka Fujita, the Secretary General of the ASEAN-Japan Center, to deliver his closing remarks.
Yes, I am Fujita from ASEAN-Japan Center. And nearly 500 people from the ASEAN region have taken part, and I would like to thank you all for taking part in this symposium despite your very busy schedule. I believe everybody is having a difficult time amid the pandemic, but let us move on together. His Excellency Mr. Min Tu, Ambassador of Myanmar, started off this symposium with his opening address. We followed that with His Excellency Dato Lim Jak Hoi, Secretary General of ASEAN's keynote speech, and then Dr. Kimura, Dr. Sukegawa, and Dr. Bautista took part in the interactive session. So we may face quite a difficult time post-COVID, according to Secretary General Lim. He talked about unprecedented uncertainty. I believe that is the word that he used. But how will the economic relationship between Japan and ASEAN change? Secretary General Lim said that in the path of recovery, we will see some weaknesses becoming apparent. And he talked about 5 points that will become important as we move toward a new normal or even a next normal. Now, based on this keynote speech, and it was among the 5 points that Mr. Lim gave, but post-corona, or while we live with corona, how will the global supply chain or the international production network change? Especially this was a high interest among people in Japan and ASEAN. Maybe supply chain will not change? To that question, I believe you already have an answer. The answer is, rather than saying it will change, it has to change. We will not be going back to pre-corona supply chain, but we will have a more resilient, more robust supply chain. So a more stronger economic relationship or a more stronger supply chain will be established in the end. With such a pandemic, the economy has gone down from its previous resilience, and governments have taken many measures in order to seek recovery. So we are trying to build up the economy so that it has a higher level of resilience. And for that, we need to have a more transformative and innovative path. Dr. Kimura talked about policies for a new normal, and he explained what paths will lead there. And in the innovative path, there are several things that I have noticed, so I'd like to talk about 3 points. One is the current international production network and the changes we see in the network. Companies, as they build up such a network, they have sought the most effective way to gain services and goods, and also most effective value chains to transport and send the goods that they've built. However, that has led to vulnerabilities in the chain. Even materials that were necessary to maintain human lives did not move during the pandemic. And Dr. Sukegawa talked about a supply chain that is more resilient seeking rather than efficiency seeking is necessary. He talked about the shift from just-in-time to just-in-case. The lean production system was a double-edged sword. In a pandemic, both the suppliers and the consumers need to fight together. The survivors will have to support the vulnerable so that we do not follow the beggar thy neighbor policy. Second point is, in the path toward a new normal, we see some effects on ASEAN. Global supply chains are contracting, meaning globalization itself is contracting. Reshoring, where companies bring back to their countries the production hubs that they have set up overseas. Already, this is a very important agenda under this pandemic. Japan has built up a supplementary budget to bring back some production hubs to Japan. Dr. Kimura says that this has not started yet. Dr. Bautista said that it is because we do not see much change in the comparative advantages yet. Reshoring does not just happen now. As companies grow or are defeated, it always happens. There is always not just investments, but negative investments or divestments as well. According to METI's analysis in ASEAN, every year more than 100 new Japanese companies will be established, but a greater number than that, business closures of Japanese companies are seen. Globalization peaked around 2015, but since then it has been contracting according to a report by UNCTAD. Slow trade, where the increase in trade volume is smaller than economic growth. This situation will continue, and FDI flow peaked in 2015, and we will not be able to catch up with that level. Looking at ASEAN, trade volume, FDI, is also growing. However, this is because the ASEAN economy itself has grown. If we look at it as a percentage of GDP, we do not see it actually growing or increasing, which means that looking at globalization from these figures, it's telling us that globalization is now standing still. So reshoring for ASEAN may not be a great worry for us. ASEAN should make efforts, continuous efforts toward building up competitiveness. And as Secretary General Lim said, ASEAN will always be open for business. The third point is Japan and ASEAN has seen their area of cooperation spreading. Secretary General Lim mentioned this as one of his 5 points, and also the panelists agreed that IT or ICT is important, especially digital transformation. Japan and ASEAN is still weak in this area. I believe we all had to admit that. There is a great business opportunity out there, and one area could be telemedicine. His Excellency Ambassador Min Tu said at the outset that ASEAN and Japan should look at this pandemic as a common issue and should take strategies that are innovative and resilient. He talked about how necessary that is. I believe everyone attending this symposium agrees to this. And with that, I would like to end my closing remarks. Once again, thank you very much to the panelists and the speakers, as well as those attending. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.
Thank you, SG Fujita. And that concludes the end of our 53rd ASEAN Anniversary Symposium. We'd like to thank all our distinguished guests and speakers for joining us today, and we would very much appreciate your feedback through our email questionnaire. Thank you very much.